Utilizing rhetorical techniques common to both American presidents and American members of Congress, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addresses a joint session of the United States Congress. His speech went for about 50 minutes, and it was worth noting that the Prime Minister made use of modern culture allusions to the Game of Thrones and to Twitter, while he also offered scriptural allusions, first to the Old Testament book of Esther, and as you heard in his concluding remarks, to the words of Moses, "Be strong and resolute." With John Bachman here at our Newsmax anchor desk as we watch the scene from the floor of the United States Congress. John, your initial impressions of the address from Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Obviously, we heard that at the very end there, the reference to Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor. They're sitting there. We saw that image in the very beginning, JD, of the shot of Benjamin Netanyahu's wife. And Elie Wiesel up there, you heard several times the thematic comparisons between what Iran is doing today and what the Nazis were doing in the run-up to World War II. Netanyahu mentioned the Iranian conquest, how they now are established in controlling operations, in not those exact words, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon. You mentioned Game of Thrones, a reference. A real masterful speech, I think, in the way he spoke not just to the folks there in that joint session of Congress, but to Americans across all generations.
And mindful of that, let's bring in some others for their reaction. First to Newsmax Washington, where we're joined by Colonel Derek Harvey. Colonel Harvey, your thoughts about what Prime Minister Netanyahu had to say?
Well, I think he did an exceptionally good job in laying out the threat and how the deal that seems to be underway between the administration and Tehran is not a good deal. It's not a good deal for the region, for Israel, or the United States.
Rick Ungar at Newsmax New York, prior to this speech, you made mention of the political challenges the Prime Minister faces. For a lot of Americans, Americans looking at this think of Richard Nixon going to China in 1972. Do you believe the Prime Minister's words here in the United States will have any positive outcome for him politically at home?
Well, it's interesting. The first part of the speech seemed to be all about talking to the folks back home, where he couldn't have worked harder to express that this was not a political adventure on his part. You know, the speech was a very, very good speech, and because of that, I think it's probably more likely than not that people back home might believe him. I'll wait until we get more into the speech to talk about maybe some of the flaws I saw in it, but I thought it was an excellent speech where he accomplished what he came to do.
All right, Rick, let's bring in Fred Fleitz now, the former CIA intelligence analyst. And Fred, I want to talk about something specifically that Netanyahu mentioned here. He mentioned that some of these details about this plan that's being worked on right now in Switzerland that the White House claims have leaked out are a matter of public record. Netanyahu mentioning this specifically, a direct rebuttal to what the White House is saying. Netanyahu said, you can Google it. What's your take on the way that he answered those claims and perhaps criticisms that are coming from the White House?
Hey, John, it's good to be here. Well, the Obama administration is playing this game where they leak details of the talks, and then when someone like myself or Netanyahu try to talk about it, they claim either we're leaking information or we don't know what's being discussed in the talks, so we can't go after it. David Ignatius, Associated Press, and Reuters, they have all gotten this information from the Obama administration. We have a pretty good idea of the outline of these talks, and I think Netanyahu was simply trying to make sure he couldn't be accused of leaking anything by passing on information that we know was given to reporters by the Obama administration.
Colonel Derek Harvey, more than rhetorical techniques, Prime Minister Netanyahu put forth a very graphic picture of what he calls two different choices. He said history places us at a crossroads, but it was interesting that he took exception to the notion that if you say no to this deal, then the die is cast for war. Instead, he says, there can be a better deal. Colonel Harvey, do you share that realistic diplomatic assumption?
I actually do, and I was just rereading some notes I have from Henry Kissinger, where he said very clearly that when you're in negotiations and you are putting sanctions on and you have them under duress, do not release your grip. Keep the pressure on until you get the deal you need is basically what we need to be doing. Instead, we've been backpedaling from this and acting as though we're the weaker partner in this situation and that our interests are not going to be hurt by a bad deal. And clearly this is a bad deal. It will lead to nuclear proliferation in the area, and it will undermine the security of our friends in Ankara, Cairo, Riyadh, and Tel Aviv.
Well, Rick, I want to ask you again about something specifically that came up in this speech that was, again, a rebuttal to the Obama administration. We heard Benjamin Netanyahu say that we are not better off without it. We're better off without it, is what he said, and that was a direct rebuttal to what we heard from Susan Rice at the AIPAC speech last night. Again, how do you think this is going to play out in the minds of Americans here at home? Who do you think wins this?
Well, actually, what I heard Susan Rice say last night is that if we better with no deal than a bad deal, which I certainly agree with. But, you know, the question J.D. asked, I think, goes right to the heart of the matter and is maybe the biggest conflict that troubled me in the speech. On the one hand, the Prime Minister made the point very well that even after all the sanctions we've imposed and all the things we've done, Iran not only was able to continue their nuclear plan, but was able to gobble up, to use his words, 4 other countries. While I understand his take on what we think is the deal, and I do have some trouble with him discussing it, but what we think it is, I get it. I have the same problems. I don't think he made a very compelling case that just doing more of the same is going to help us. We can increase sanctions. I'm okay with that. We can negotiate harder. I'm certainly okay with that. But that doesn't lead me to believe that they're going to stop enriching uranium. So this was the biggest flaw that I saw. It just kind of felt like, while I understand that he may not like what he thinks the deal is that we're doing, I don't hear where he's offering something that's likely to work better, and that's disconcerting to me.
Well, let me turn then to Colonel Derek Harvey, who just made mention of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the techniques of using economic sanctions. Sounds like Rick Ungar has a different point of view. Derek, your take on why sanctions should actually be applied in greater fashion?
Well, we've actually taken some of the pressure off. We've released our grip, and we need to keep it on, and we need to continue to look for other ways of keeping a coalition together and maintaining sanctions and strengthening them. But we can also contest Iranian malign behavior and what they're doing in supporting terrorism and other malign activities in the region more aggressively with our partners in that part of the world. We have really not taken on Tehran's activities in any direct way, and we've only really worked on the margins. So I really think there's a lot more that we can do without this idea of this false choice of it's war or this deal.
Newsmax TV continue.
I got to respond.
Okay, Rick,
I'll
go
wait
ahead.
to respond. Yeah, I just don't understand that. Look, he told us, if you believe what the Prime Minister told us, even if we've let our foot off the gas pedal, and you might be right about that, sir, that it still allowed them to gobble up 4 countries and continue their nuclear program. These are people who support terrorism all over the world. They are fanatics. Why do you think that more of it is going to stop them?
Let's let Derek respond to that, because he's dealt with the ultimate realpolitik military conflict. Colonel Harvey, respond to Mr. Ungar, please.
They generally know that we do not respond to their kinetic actions or the use of proxies that they have that have killed Americans, and they're responsible for killing about 1/3 of the Americans in Iraq. Secondly, when we released sanctions and let up some of the pressure, that enabled them to continue to fund and increase funding to the Syrian Assad regime to the tune of about $4 billion over a 12-month period. That is not keeping the pressure on. That is enabling Iranian expansion and hegemonic designs.